A nurse was hired to take care of an 80-year-old woman who appeared every morning with cuts on her arms. Frightened, he hid under the bed to observe during the night and panicked at what he heard. Sebastian parked the car in front of house number 342, an old two-story building with large windows and a garden that had seen better days. The porch lights were on, casting elongated shadows over the stone path that led to the front door. He turned off the engine and remained seated for a few moments, observing the facade through the windshield blurred by the night fog. It was his first night shift at that house, and the responsibility weighed on his shoulders like a backpack full of bricks. He breathed deeply, gripping the strap of his nursing bag tightly, feeling the cold leather against the palm of his hand. The family had been clear during the interview. 80-year-old Mrs. Abigail needed constant care, especially at night, when her mental confusion seemed to worsen. Sebastian opened the car door, and the cold dawn air hit him like a slap in the face. "First night, Sebastian, you can do it," he muttered to himself, trying to push away the nervousness that tightened his stomach. Abigail's daughter, a woman in her 50s named Victoria, opened the door before he even rang the doorbell. Her eyes were swollen, with deep dark circles that betrayed sleepless nights, and her brown hair was tied in a careless bun. She held a cup of coffee with both hands, as if she needed the warmth to keep standing. Sebastian noticed that her hands trembled slightly, making the dark liquid sway inside the cup. Victoria forced a tired smile, but her eyes remained worried, distant, as if they were seeing something Sebastian couldn't see. She gestured for him to enter, and the aroma of old coffee and medications invaded Sebastian's nostrils as soon as he crossed the threshold. The house was too quiet, only the monotonous tick-tock of a wall clock breaking the oppressive silence. "My mother is sleeping in the second-floor bedroom," said Victoria, her voice low and hoarse as if she had been screaming for hours before. "She took her medicine at 8 o'clock, so she should be calm until morning." Her tone didn't seem very convinced, and Sebastian noticed the doubt hidden behind those words. Victoria led him to the second floor, climbing up the wooden steps that creaked under their feet, each sound echoing through the empty house like a warning. The corridor walls were decorated with old photographs in silver frames, smiling faces from better times, frozen in the past. Sebastian observed a photo of a young Abigail, still in her 40s, embracing a grey-haired man with a wide smile, probably her deceased husband. They looked happy, complete, as if nothing bad could touch them. The reality of the present seemed cruel compared to that image of happiness captured decades ago. Victoria stopped in front of a partially open door and pushed it slowly, revealing a spacious room dimly lit by a lamp on the bedside table. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled, and an instant chill ran down Sebastian's spine. Victoria's eyes widened, letting the coffee cup fall to the corridor floor with a crash that reverberated throughout the house. "Mom! Mom, where are you?" she shouted, entering the room with quick, desperate steps. Sebastian felt his heart racing inside his chest, pumping adrenaline throughout his body. That's when he saw her. Abigail was lying on the floor between the bed and the wall, her thin, fragile body folded in an uncomfortable position, like an abandoned rag doll. Her face was pale, almost grey, and a thin layer of sweat covered her wrinkled forehead. Her lips were parted, and a thread of saliva trickled from the corner of her mouth. Sebastian felt his training take over his movements, and without thinking twice he rushed to her, kneeling by her side and holding her delicate wrist between his fingers. Her pulse was weak, irregular, almost imperceptible beneath the thin skin marked by old bruises. Victoria was paralyzed at the door, hands covering her mouth, eyes widened with terror. Sebastian turned his head quickly toward her, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic that threatened to take over. "Call an ambulance now," he ordered, and Victoria ran out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the stairs. Sebastian turned his attention back to Abigail, checking her breathing, which came out in small, irregular and weak sighs. "Mrs. Abigail, can you hear me?" "I'm here to help," he said, his voice coming out softer, trying to reach her wherever she was. Abigail didn't respond, but her eyes moved beneath her closed eyelids, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Sebastian placed his hand on her forehead and felt the cold, damp skin, an alarming contrast to the temperature of the room, which was stuffy and hot. He quickly opened his nursing bag taking out the blood pressure monitor and wrapping the cuff around Abigail's thin arm. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay calm, pumping air into the cuff and watching the display carefully. Her pressure was dangerously low, much lower than it should be for someone her age, even with controlled medication. Sebastian felt a knot form in his stomach, an uncomfortable weight of responsibility and fear. He quickly got up, running to the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom, filling a glass with cold water and returning to Abigail's side. He knelt down again, gently lifting her head and moistening her lips with a few drops of water. "Come on, Mrs. Abigail, I need you to stay with me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Her breathing remained weak, and Sebastian knew that every second counted. While waiting for the ambulance, he looked around the room, trying to understand what had happened. The bedside table was covered with medicine bottles, a veritable portable pharmacy. There were medications for diabetes, blood pressure, anxiety, sleep, pain, each with colored labels and detailed instructions. Sebastian picked up some of the bottles, reading the labels with growing attention. The doses seemed normal, but the number of different medications was alarming. He tried to mentally calculate whether all those substances could interact in dangerous ways, but there were too many variables, too many possibilities. Abigail mumbled something incomprehensible, a low, slurred sound that barely came out of her throat. Sebastian leaned in closer, trying to decipher the words, but they were lost in a confused tangle of sounds. He held her hand, squeezing it gently, trying to convey some kind of comfort through touch. "The ambulance is on its way, Mrs. Abigail. Everything will be fine," he said, desperately wishing it were true. But deep down, an instinct trained by years of experience whispered that something was very, very wrong. Sebastian looked under the bed, searching for anything that might have fallen or that would explain Abigail's fall. What he saw made him freeze for a moment. There were more medicine bottles there, hidden under the wooden bed frame, some lying on their sides, others standing upright, and several completely empty. He reached out, pulling some of the bottles into the lamplight, and his heart sank even further in his chest. They were the same medications that were on the bedside table, but these were clearly hidden, purposely placed out of sight. The expiration date on some of them indicated they had been purchased recently, but were already empty. Sebastian felt a chill run down his spine, an uncomfortable feeling that he had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple nighttime fall. He placed the bottles on the floor beside him, making a mental note to show them to the paramedics when they arrived. Abigail moaned again, and Sebastian turned all his attention back to her, checking her vital signs once more. "What's going on here, Mrs. Abigail?" he asked quietly, knowing she couldn't answer. The question hung in the air like a dense and unsettling fog. The minutes dragged on like hours, until finally Sebastian heard the distant sound of the ambulance siren, cutting through the silence of the night. Victoria came running back to the room, her face red and wet with tears, her breathing labored. She fell to her knees beside Sebastian, taking her mother's hand and pressing it against her chest, sobbing loudly. Sebastian placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to convey some reassurance, but his own hands were still trembling slightly. The siren grew louder, closer, until finally it stopped in front of the house and the sound of doors slamming and quick footsteps invaded the quietness of the environment. 2 paramedics came up the stairs with a stretcher and a bag of equipment, moving with the rehearsed efficiency of those who do this every day. Sebastian stood up, giving them space to work, but remained nearby, watching every movement. One of the paramedics, a tall man in his 40s with short hair and a serious expression, knelt beside Abigail, quickly checking her vital signs. "The pressure is very low," Sebastian said, his voice coming out steady despite the tension. "She was unconscious when I arrived, and her breathing is irregular." The paramedic nodded, already placing an oxygen mask on Abigail's face. The second paramedic, a young woman with her hair tied in a tight ponytail, began preparing a folding stretcher, opening it with quick and precise movements. Victoria wouldn't stop crying, repeating her mother's name like a desperate prayer, and Sebastian had to gently hold her by the shoulders to move her back a little and give space for the professionals to work. He felt the tension in her muscles, the resistance of someone who doesn't want to move away from someone they love, but who knows they need to. The older paramedic took a small flashlight, opening Abigail's eyelids and checking her pupil response. Sebastian observed carefully, noticing the delay in response, the slow and uneven movement. That wasn't a good sign. "We're taking her now," said the paramedic, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to stabilize her at the hospital." Victoria sobbed louder, and Sebastian squeezed her shoulder again, trying to transmit some kind of strength. "I'll go with her," said Sebastian, looking directly at the paramedic. "I'm the nurse hired to care for her." The man nodded, and together they carefully lifted Abigail, placing her on the stretcher. While they descended the stairs, Sebastian grabbed the medicine bottles he had found under the bed, stuffing them into his lab coat pocket. Something inside him said this would be important, that those hidden bottles were a piece of a much larger and darker puzzle. Victoria ran ahead, opening the front door and letting the cold night invade the house. The ambulance was parked with red and blue lights flashing, painting the house facade with alternating ghostly colors. Neighbors began appearing in windows, curious and concerned, but Sebastian barely registered their presence. His attention was completely focused on Abigail, who was now being carried into the ambulance, her small and fragile body seeming to almost disappear beneath the thermal blankets that the paramedics had placed over her. Victoria tried to climb into the ambulance too, but the paramedic gently stopped her, explaining there was space for only one companion besides the medical team. Sebastian looked at Victoria, seeing the conflict in her eyes, the fear of letting her mother go without her. "I'll take care of her," he promised, and Victoria nodded, tears still running down her face. "Please save my mother," she begged, her voice breaking on the last word. Sebastian climbed into the ambulance, sitting on the small side bench while the paramedics closed the doors and tapped on the glass separating the cabin, signaling for the driver to depart. The vehicle pulled away with a jolt, and the siren sounded again, cutting through the night like a sharp blade. Sebastian held onto the support bar as the ambulance swayed around curves, his eyes fixed on Abigail. The female paramedic was checking her blood pressure again, adjusting the oxygen flow, and the older paramedic was preparing an intravenous line, connecting a bag of saline solution. Sebastian observed everything with professional attention, but also with a growing concern he couldn't ignore. Abigail was very pale, very quiet, and her breathing remained irregular despite the oxygen. "How long has she been like this?" asked the female paramedic, without taking her eyes off the monitors. "I'm not sure," Sebastian replied, feeling the weight of uncertainty. "I had just arrived for my shift and found her on the floor. Her daughter said she had taken her medications at 8 o'clock, but I don't know if she checked on her after that." The paramedic nodded, making notes on a clipboard. The older paramedic finished inserting the intravenous needle into Abigail's arm, securing it with transparent adhesive tape. The solution began to drip slowly, entering her bloodstream, but Sebastian knew this was just a temporary measure, a way to keep her stable until they reached the hospital. He looked through the rear window of the ambulance, watching the city lights pass in quick blurs, the empty streets of early morning witnessing their desperate race. He thought of Victoria, imagining her alone in that huge house waiting for news, blaming herself for not checking on her mother earlier. He thought about the bottles hidden under the bed, and an uncomfortable question began to take shape in his mind. "Does she take many medications?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but the paramedic caught the underlying tone of concern. "According to the file we received, yes," she replied, checking a paper. "Diabetes, hypertension, anxiety, insomnia. It's common in patients her age." But Sebastian couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something nobody was seeing. Suddenly Abigail moved. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but Sebastian saw it. She tried to raise her hand, her fingers slightly twisting, and her lips moved as if she were trying to speak. Sebastian leaned forward, getting as close to her as he could without disrupting the paramedics. "Mrs. Abigail, can you hear me?" he asked, keeping his voice low and calm. Her eyes opened a crack, just enough for Sebastian to see the yellowish white and the dilated pupils. She looked in his direction, but seemed unable to focus, as if she were looking through him at something distant and frightening. Her mouth opened more, and a hoarse sound came from her throat, words forming slowly, with effort. Sebastian held her hand, feeling the cold and damp touch of her skin against his. "I'm here, Mrs. Abigail, you're safe now," he said, trying to reassure her. But what she said next made Sebastian's blood freeze in his veins. "She gives me more pills," whispered Abigail, her voice so low that Sebastian had to move even closer to hear. "Says I forgot to take them, but I remember. I always remember." The words came out fragmented, broken by difficult breathing, but each one fell on Sebastian like a heavy stone. He felt his heart speed up, his pulse beating strongly at his temples. Abigail weakly squeezed his hand, as if trying to convey an urgency that her weak body couldn't express. Her eyes closed again, the momentary strength draining as quickly as it had come, and she sank back into unconsciousness. Sebastian was paralyzed for a second, processing what he had just heard. She, Abigail had said, someone was giving her extra medication, someone was doing this purposefully. "What did she say?" asked the female paramedic, noticing the shocked expression on Sebastian's face. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could form the words, Abigail's heart monitor began to beep in an irregular and alarming rhythm. The older paramedic immediately moved, checking the electrodes connected to Abigail's chest, adjusting the equipment. "Arrhythmia," he said, his voice tense. "We need to stabilize her quickly." The female paramedic increased the oxygen flow, and Sebastian saw Abigail's chest rise and fall irregularly, as if her body was fighting against itself. The monitor's beeping continued, each sound piercing Sebastian's ears like a needle. He squeezed Abigail's hand, as if he could somehow keep her anchored to the world of the living through that touch. "Hang on, Mrs. Abigail," he murmured, knowing she probably couldn't hear him, but needing to say it anyway. "You need to tell what's happening. You need to tell me who's doing this to you." The ambulance made a sharp turn, and Sebastian had to hold on tight to avoid falling. The driver was accelerating, probably sensing the urgency through internal communications. "How long until the hospital?" shouted the paramedic to the cabin. 3 minutes, came the muffled response. 3 minutes that seemed like an eternity. Sebastian looked at Abigail, seeing the deathly pallor of her face, the sweat running down her wrinkled forehead, her lips slightly blue despite the oxygen. She seemed so fragile, so on the edge of the abyss, and he felt powerless, trapped in that moving metal box while watching someone fight for their life. But her words echoed in his mind, refusing to be ignored. "She gives me more pills." Who was she, Victoria? Some other family member, a previous caregiver? And why would someone do this? Was it negligence, confusion, or something more sinister? Sebastian felt a wave of anger growing inside him, mixed with helplessness. If someone was really slowly poisoning Abigail with excessive doses of medication, then he had arrived just in time. But he had also arrived too late to prevent her from reaching that critical state. "Will she be okay?" he asked the female paramedic, even knowing she probably didn't have a definitive answer. The woman looked at him with tired but kind eyes. "We'll do everything we can," she answered, and that would have to be enough for now. The ambulance finally began to slow down, and Sebastian heard the sound of the siren change tone becoming deeper. They had reached the hospital. The rear doors suddenly opened, revealing the illuminated entrance of the emergency room, where a medical team was already waiting with a clean stretcher and ready equipment. The paramedic and the female paramedic worked quickly, transferring Abigail to the hospital stretcher, disconnecting the ambulance monitors and reconnecting them to the portable ones. Sebastian got out of the ambulance, his legs slightly trembling from adrenaline, and followed alongside the stretcher as they rushed into the hospital. The automatic doors opened with a hiss, and the characteristic smell of hospital, that mixture of disinfectant and medications, invaded his nostrils. A doctor in a white coat, black hair tied in a tight bun and sharp dark eyes, approached quickly, listening to the paramedics' report as they walked. 80-year-old woman, found unconscious, low blood pressure, recent cardiac arrhythmia, possible medication overdose, recited the older paramedic, handing over the clipboard with notes. The doctor took the clipboard, reading quickly while walking. "Take her to room 3, she ordered, her voice firm and controlled. "We need complete blood tests, electrocardiogram, and an urgent toxicological evaluation." Sebastian tried to follow the stretcher into the emergency room, but a nurse stopped him, placing her hand gently but firmly on his chest. "Are you family?" she asked, her voice professional but not unkind. Sebastian hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking beyond her to where Abigail was being quickly surrounded by doctors and nurses, each performing specific tasks with rehearsed efficiency. "I'm her private nurse," he replied, feeling frustration growing inside him. "I need to stay with her. There are things you need to know." The nurse looked at him with an expression that mixed understanding and inflexibility. "You can give us the information here," she said, taking a clipboard from a nearby counter. "But the medical team needs space to work. You know how it is." Sebastian knew. He had been on the other side of this situation dozens of times, but now being barred from caring for someone who was under his responsibility, the frustration was almost unbearable. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, and began to report everything he knew, from the moment he arrived at the house to the words whispered by Abigail in the ambulance. The nurse noted everything meticulously, asking specific questions about the medications Abigail was taking, about her medical history, about anything that might be relevant. Sebastian mentioned the bottles he had found hidden under the bed, and the nurse raised an eyebrow, her expression becoming more serious. "Did you bring these bottles?" she asked. Sebastian reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small plastic containers and placing them on the counter. The nurse picked up one of them, examining the label, and then called one of the doctors who was quickly passing through the corridor. "Doctor, you need to see this," she said, showing the bottles. The doctor, a man in his 50s with graying hair and reading glasses hanging from his neck, took the bottles, examining them with growing attention. He read the labels, checked the dates, and his expression became increasingly grave. "Are all these medications from the same patient?" he asked, looking at Sebastian. "Yes, I found them hidden under her bed," Sebastian replied. "And she told me something in the ambulance, said that someone was giving her more pills, telling her she had forgotten to take them." The doctor exchanged a significant look with the nurse. "Possible intentional medication intoxication," said the doctor, his voice low but firm. "We need to do a complete toxicological evaluation and find out exactly what's in her system." He turned to Sebastian, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made Sebastian understand the gravity of the situation. "You did well to bring this. You may have saved her life." The words should have brought some comfort, but Sebastian felt only an even greater weight. If Abigail was being slowly poisoned, then he had stepped into something much more complicated than a simple night caregiver job. He had entered a situation of abuse, perhaps even attempted homicide. The doctor handed the bottles back to the nurse. "Catalogue this as evidence and send it for analysis, and call me when the blood test results arrive." He looked at Sebastian again. "You'll need to talk to the police about this. If there's suspicion of a crime, they need to be informed." Sebastian nodded, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. He had just met Abigail, and now he was in the middle of a potential criminal investigation. The nurse led Sebastian to a small waiting room reserved for family members, a claustrophobic space with blue plastic chairs and a coffee machine that seemed not to have worked for years. Sebastian sat down, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. His heart was still beating fast, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but now, with a moment of forced calm, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Abigail was fighting for her life in the room next door, and someone had caused that. Someone she knew who had access to her, who could give her medications without raising suspicions. Sebastian thought about Victoria, the way she had reacted upon finding her mother on the floor, the genuine despair in her eyes. Would she be capable of doing something like this? Or was there someone else? A previous caregiver perhaps, or another family member? The possibilities spun in his mind like a sinister carousel. He stood up, unable to stay still, and began pacing back and forth in the small room, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. "What did I do by accepting this job?" he muttered to himself, but even as he asked the question, he knew he had no choice but to continue. Abigail needed him, needed someone who believed her and would discover the truth. The door to the waiting room opened, and Sebastian turned quickly, expecting to see the doctor or nurse with news, but the one who entered was Victoria, her face still red and wet with tears, her eyes swollen from crying. She stopped when she saw Sebastian, and for a moment they just looked at each other, two strangers united by a night of terror. Victoria stepped forward, her hands trembling. "How is she?" she asked, her voice broken and hoarse. "Have you seen my mother?" Will she be all right? Sebastian saw the genuine despair in those eyes, saw a daughter's love for her mother, and for a moment his suspicion wavered. But then he remembered Abigail's words, the way she had said she, and the doubt returned with full force. She's being attended to now, Sebastian replied, keeping his voice neutral, professional. The doctors are doing everything they can. Victoria took another step, coming closer, and Sebastian could smell perfume mixed with sweat. What happened? Why was she in that state? I gave her the right medicines at the right time, like I always do, said Victoria, her voice rising in pitch on the edge of hysteria. Sebastian observed every micro-expression on her face, every movement of her hands, trying to read beyond the words. I found medicine bottles hidden under her bed, Sebastian said, deciding to test Victoria's reaction. Empty bottles. It seems someone was giving her extra medication. Victoria's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. What? That can't be true. Who would do such a thing? She exclaimed, and the disbelief in her voice seemed too genuine to be faked. But Sebastian had seen good actors before, people who could lie while looking directly into someone's eyes. The woman's face paled even more, if that was possible, and she staggered backward, holding onto the doorframe as if her legs might give way at any moment. Her lips trembled, trying to form words that couldn't come out, and her hands clutched the fabric of her blouse at chest level, wrinkling the fabric forcefully. Sebastian saw panic growing in her eyes, that kind of terror that comes when someone realizes something terrible is happening and can't fully comprehend it. Victoria finally managed to take a deep breath, the air entering her lungs in a broken and painful gasp. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, the door to the waiting room opened again forcefully, and a man hurried in, closely followed by a young woman. "Victoria, how's your mother? What happened?" asked the man, his voice laden with urgent concern. Sebastian immediately recognized that this must be Jackson, the son-in-law, and the young woman was probably Ella, Abigail's granddaughter. Jackson was a man of average height, probably in his mid-50s, with brown hair beginning to gray at the temples and a prominent belly that slightly stretched his light blue dress shirt. His brown eyes were bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept for days, and there were deep shadows under them indicating chronic fatigue. He wore wrinkled dress pants and shoes that looked like they had been put on in a hurry, without socks. Sebastian noticed that the man was sweating profusely, despite the hospital's strong air conditioning, and his hands visibly trembled when he extended them to touch Victoria's shoulder. There was something genuinely worried in his posture, in the way his shoulders were tense, as if he carried an invisible but very real weight. Ella, on the other hand, was a thin young woman of 25, with long, straight brown hair that fell over her shoulders in a disorderly fashion, as if she had just gotten out of bed. Her red and swollen eyes indicated that she had been crying a lot, and her face was pale, almost translucent under the merciless fluorescent light of the hospital. She wore an oversized sweatshirt and sweatpants, clearly clothes she had thrown on in a hurry. "Mom, what happened to Grandma? Will she be okay?" asked Ella, her voice coming out high-pitched and broken between sobs. Victoria looked at her husband and daughter, and something in her expression changed, as if their presence gave her strength she didn't have alone. She straightened her shoulders, wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, and took another deep breath, this time with more control. "Your grandmother is being treated by the doctors now," said Victoria, her voice still trembling but firmer than before. "She had a serious episode at home, and this is the nurse who found her," she pointed to Sebastian, and all eyes in the room turned to him. Sebastian felt the weight of those stares, the intensity of the scrutiny, and maintained his posture erect, professional, even though inside an uneasiness began to grow. Jackson extended his hand to Sebastian, and they greeted each other with a firm but brief handshake. "Thank you for taking care of her," said Jackson, and there was sincerity in his voice, but also a deep fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. Ella, however, didn't approach. She stayed beside her mother, her wide eyes fixed on Sebastian with an expression of pure fear and concern for her grandmother. "Did he just start working with Grandma?" Ella asked, looking at her mother but keeping Sebastian in her peripheral vision. "Yes, this was his first night," Victoria replied, and there was a hesitation in her voice now, as if she herself was beginning to question something. Sebastian felt a tightness in his chest, an uncomfortable feeling that the narrative was beginning to shift, and not in his favor. He opened his mouth to explain again what he had found, the hidden bottles, Abigail's words, but before he could speak, the door opened once more, and the doctor Sebastian had seen earlier entered the waiting room, her immaculate white coat contrasting with the palpable tension in the air. She held a clipboard against her chest, and her expression was serious, professional, but with a gravity that made Sebastian's heart sink. Everyone in the room turned to her immediately, and silence fell like a heavy curtain. The doctor looked at each of them before speaking, her dark, penetrating eyes assessing the group. "We've managed to stabilize patient Abigail," she began, and there was a collective sigh of relief in the room. "But the diagnosis is alarming and very concerning. She suffered a severe medication overdose. The levels of various substances in her blood are dangerously high." The doctor paused, letting the information sink in, and Sebastian saw shock spread across the faces of Victoria, Jackson, and Ella. "Someone is giving this patient excessive medication," the doctor continued, her voice taking on a more serious and firm tone. "This could be fatal for her. Who is responsible for the medications?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sebastian felt as if the air had been sucked from the room, and all eyes, including the doctor's, eventually turned to him. It wasn't immediate, but gradual, like a slow but inevitable tide. Victoria was first, her eyes widening slightly as she processed the question. Jackson frowned, looking from Sebastian to Victoria and back to Sebastian. Ella stepped back, her hand flying to cover her mouth, and her eyes filled with renewed tears. Sebastian felt his heart beat faster, blood roaring in his ears, and a growing sense of injustice began to burn in his chest. "I just got hired," said Sebastian, forcing his voice to remain calm and controlled. "This was literally my first night caring for Miss Abigail. I found her unconscious and called the ambulance immediately." He looked directly at the doctor, needing her to understand. "I didn't administer any medication to her. When I arrived, she was already in that state." The doctor nodded slowly, making notes on her clipboard, but her expression remained neutral, professional, not revealing whether she believed him or not. "And who is normally responsible for the patient's medication?" she asked, now looking at Victoria. Victoria swallowed hard, and Sebastian saw her throat move with the effort. Her hands interlaced in front of her body, fingers squeezing so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I am," Victoria answered, her voice coming out almost in a whisper. "I've been taking care of my mother for years. I've always given her medications, always in the right doses, always at the right times. I note everything down in a notebook." She looked around the room, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I would never give the wrong medication to my mother. Never. I love her more than anything in this world." Tears began to roll down Victoria's face again, and Jackson wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. Ella also approached, placing her hand on her mother's shoulder, forming a family unit that suddenly made Sebastian feel like an outsider, an intruder. The doctor continued making notes, her pen scratching the paper in quick, precise movements. "I'll need to see that notebook," she said without looking up. "And I'll need a complete list of all medications the patient should be taking, with doses and schedules. I'll also need to speak with the pharmacist who provided the prescriptions." She finally looked up, her gaze passing over each person in the room. "This is a very serious situation. We're talking about possible medical negligence or worse, something intentional." "He just started yesterday," Victoria suddenly said, her voice gaining a hysterical edge that Sebastian hadn't heard before. "Could he have given the wrong medications? Could he have confused the doses?" She pointed at Sebastian with a trembling hand, and Sebastian felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke, and he saw doubt begin to form in the doctor's eyes. "I didn't give her any medication," Sebastian protested, his voice rising in volume despite his efforts to keep it controlled. "I literally just arrived when I found her unconscious. I didn't even have time to do anything except call you." Ella stepped forward, her face contorted in a mixture of pain and confusion. "Yeah, Grandma never had these problems before he arrived," she said, her voice coming out shrill and tearful. "She was fine. She took her medications correctly. We always took care of her. Sebastian looked at Ella, seeing the genuine desperation in her eyes, the pain of seeing her grandmother in that state, and felt a wave of frustration and helplessness. How could he prove his innocence when everything seemed to conspire against him? I found medication bottles hidden under her bed, Sebastian said, his voice coming out harder now, defensive. Empty bottles. Someone was giving her extra medication, and it wasn't me. The revelation fell on the room like a bomb. Victoria's eyes widened, her mouth opening in shock. Jackson frowned even more, confusion clear in his expression. Ella covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with renewed sobs. The doctor looked at Sebastian with renewed interest, her pen stopping mid-note. "Hidden bottles," she repeated, her voice gaining an urgency that wasn't there before. "What kind of bottles? Did you bring them?" Sebastian nodded quickly, feeling a flash of hope that finally someone was taking his words seriously. "Yes, I brought them. They're with the nurse at reception. They're the same medications she should be taking, but there were several empty bottles hidden under the bed, as if someone was keeping evidence or trying to hide the excess." Victoria shook her head vigorously, more tears streaming down her face. "That doesn't make sense. Why would there be hidden bottles? I keep all her medications on the bedside table, organized by time." Jackson ran his hand through his hair, clearly trying to process everything. "Maybe your mother hid them," he suggested, looking at his wife. "You know she's been confused lately. Maybe she took old bottles and hid them for some reason that made sense to her." The suggestion seemed reasonable, but Sebastian couldn't shake Abigail's words echoing in his mind. Ella lowered her hands from her face, revealing red eyes and tear-stained cheeks. She sniffed loudly, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her hoodie, and looked at the doctor with a pleading expression. "Grandma sometimes hides things," Ella said, her voice coming out choked but clear. "She gets confused, you know how elderly people are. She probably took old bottles from somewhere and hid them under the bed. She does these things sometimes, forgets where she put things, gets disoriented." There was a sincerity in her voice, a genuine concern, and Sebastian saw the doctor nod slowly as if the explanation made sense. The doctor turned her attention back to the clipboard, making more notes. "I'll examine these bottles personally," she said, "and I'll need to speak with all household members to understand the patient's medication routine. For now, the most important thing is keeping her stable." She looked directly at Sebastian, and there was a firmness in her eyes that was undeniable. "The next 48 hours are critical," she said, letting each word hang in the air. "If there's another medication overdose, her liver and kidneys won't be able to handle it. Her kidney function is already compromised, and any additional mistake could be fatal." The gravity in her voice made everyone in the room fall into absolute silence. The doctor paused, letting the severity of the situation sink in, and then continued with an even firmer voice. "We need rigorous control of medications. Absolutely rigorous. Nothing will be administered without double and triple verification. Nothing will be given without complete documentation." Her eyes landed on Sebastian, and he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical accusation. "Will you continue as the caregiver?" the doctor asked, and there was a layer of doubt in her voice that Sebastian couldn't ignore. There was also protection there, as if she were asking if it was safe to keep him in the position. Victoria stepped forward before Sebastian could answer, wiping the tears from her face with the backs of her hands. "We hired him, and we need someone to take care of my mother," she said, but there was a hesitation in her voice that didn't convey confidence. "But I want to make sure everything is being done correctly. My mother cannot go through this again. She won't survive." Jackson placed his hand on his wife's shoulder, squeezing lightly, a gesture of silent support. "Perhaps we should have more supervision," he suggested, looking at the doctor. "Just to be sure, you know. To protect my mother-in-law." There was diplomacy in his words, trying not to directly accuse Sebastian, but also not completely defending him. Sebastian felt humiliation burning in his cheeks. He had worked as a nurse for more than 10 years, had an impeccable reputation, had saved lives, and now he was being treated as if he were a potential criminal. But he swallowed his wounded pride and nodded, understanding that protesting too much would only make him appear more guilty. "I understand your concern," he said, forcing his voice to remain professional and calm. And I accept any supervision you want to implement. But I swear on everything sacred that I did nothing wrong. I found Mrs. Abigail in that state and did everything I could to save her." The doctor closed her clipboard and took a step toward the door, clearly preparing to leave and return to her other duties. "I'll leave you to discuss the arrangements," she said, her voice returning to its professional and neutral tone. "But while the patient is admitted here, we will rigorously monitor all medication. Nothing will be administered without my direct approval or that of the responsible medical team." She looked at Sebastian one more time, and this time there was something in her gaze that was difficult to decipher, perhaps caution, perhaps just the fatigue of having to deal with another complicated situation. "And you, nurse, will note down every medicine you give, every procedure you perform with exact date and time. This is both for the protection of the patient and for your own protection. Is that clear?" Sebastian nodded firmly, maintaining eye contact. "Yes, doctor," Sebastian replied, keeping his posture erect and professional. "I will do exactly that. All medication, every procedure, everything documented with precision." The doctor gave a final nod to the group and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the corridor as she walked away. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound seemed too loud in the heavy silence that had fallen over the waiting room. Sebastian could feel the eyes of Victoria, Jackson, and Ella upon him, evaluating him, judging him, deciding whether they could trust him or not. He kept his expression neutral, professional, but inside a storm of emotions was brewing. Anger at the unfair accusation, frustration at not being able to immediately prove his innocence, and a growing determination to discover what was really happening with Abigail. Because something was wrong, very wrong, and he wasn't going to rest until he discovered the truth. Victoria was the first to break the silence, her voice coming out low and tired. "I want to see my mother," she said, looking at Jackson and then at Ella. "I need to see her, talk to her, even if she can't hear me." Jackson nodded in agreement, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Let's all see her," he said, his voice trying to bring some comfort. "Let's make sure she knows we're here." Ella wiped her face once more, trying to compose herself, and nodded vigorously. "I need to see Grandma too," she said, her voice still shaky but determined. "I need to know she'll be okay. She's everything to me." There was an intensity in her words, a devotion that touched something in Sebastian, reminding him of why he had chosen that profession. To help people, to care for them in their most vulnerable moments. Sebastian decided to take the initiative, even knowing he was under suspicion. "I'll check if she can receive visitors now," he said, moving toward the door. "She's in serious condition, so the doctors may limit the number of people in the room at a time, but I'll see what I can do." He left the waiting room before anyone could respond, feeling momentary relief at being away from those accusing eyes, and walked down the white, sterile corridor to the nurse's station. The nurse who had taken his information earlier was there, typing something into the computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard with the practice of years of experience. She looked up when Sebastian approached and gave a small sympathetic smile, an oasis of kindness in a desert of accusations. "How are you holding up?" she asked, and there was genuine gentleness in her voice that made Sebastian realize that she, at least, wasn't judging him. "It's been a difficult night, I imagine." The understanding in her voice almost made Sebastian's defenses crumble. Sebastian let out a long, tired sigh, leaning on the counter of the nurse's station, feeling the weight of the last few hours finally starting to press him down. His shoulders ached, his head throbbed with the beginning of a tension headache, and he suddenly realized he hadn't eaten or drunk anything for hours. "The family is blaming me," he said, keeping his voice low so no one passing in the hallway could hear. "They think I gave her the wrong medication, even though I've explained I had just arrived and found her unconscious." The nurse grimaced sympathetically, stopping her typing and giving him her full attention. "Unfortunately, that's common," she said with a sigh. "When something like this happens, families need someone to blame. It's easier to blame the stranger, the newcomer, than to consider it might have been negligence from someone close, or even from the patient herself." She paused, looking at Sebastian with kind but serious eyes. "But you did the right thing bringing those bottles. They're being analyzed in the lab right now. The truth will come out, it always does." Her words brought some comfort, But Sebastian knew that waiting for the truth could cost him his reputation and career. "The family wants to see the patient," said Sebastian, changing the subject because thinking too much about the injustice of the situation was starting to consume him. "Is she in any condition to receive visitors?" The nurse turned her attention back to the computer, clicking through a few screens and quickly reading the information that appeared. "She's stable at the moment," she replied after a few seconds, "but still unconscious. The doctors have lightly sedated her so that her body can recover from the shock of the poisoning without additional stress. Her vital signs are being constantly monitored." She looked back at Sebastian. "They can visit her, but only 2 at a time, and for short periods of no more than 10 minutes. We don't want to overwhelm her or raise her blood pressure with too much stimulation." Sebastian nodded, understanding the precautions. It was standard protocol for patients in serious condition, and he had seen it implemented hundreds of times in his career. "I'll inform the family," he said. "Thank you." The nurse gave another gentle smile. "And Sebastian," she said, making him stop when he was already turning to leave. "Keep your head up, you saved her life tonight, don't forget that." Her words touched something deep inside him, a reminder that despite all the accusation and suspicion, he had done his job, and Abigail was alive because of it. He nodded in gratitude and returned to the waiting room. When Sebastian entered the waiting room, he found Victoria, Jackson, and Ella sitting together, talking in low voices. They stopped when they saw him, turning their faces toward him with expressions that mixed hope and apprehension. Sebastian maintained his professional posture, ignoring the discomfort he felt under their gazes. "She's stable and can receive visitors," he informed them, keeping his voice neutral and factual. "But only 2 people at a time, and for short periods of no more than 10 minutes. She's still sedated, so she won't respond, but you can stay by her side." Victoria immediately stood up, quickly followed by Ella, and the 2 women looked at each other, a silent communication passing between mother and daughter. "We'll go first," said Victoria, her voice still shaky, but with determination. "Jackson, can you wait here and go afterward?" Jackson nodded, remaining seated, and gestured for them to go. "Of course, you 2 go first. Tell her I'm here." Sebastian offered to guide them to Abigail's room, and Victoria and Ella followed him in silence through the white, sterile corridors of the hospital. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the polished linoleum floor, mixing with the distant beeping of monitors and the low murmur of medical voices. The walk to Abigail's room was short, but seemed to last an eternity. Sebastian could feel the tension emanating from Victoria and Ella behind him, could hear Victoria's controlled breathing, trying to stay calm, and Ella's occasional sniffles trying to hold back more tears. When they reached the door of the room, Sebastian stopped and turned to them. "She has several monitors and an intravenous line," he explained gently, preparing them for what they would see. "It might look scary, but all of this is helping her recover. Don't be alarmed by the equipment." Victoria nodded, squeezing Ella's hand, and together they entered the room. Sebastian stayed outside, giving them privacy, but positioning himself where he could see through the glass window in the door in case they needed anything. He saw Victoria approach the bed, her hands trembling as she reached for Abigail's pale hand, and Ella on the other side, leaning down to kiss her grandmother's forehead. Both were crying silently, their shoulders shaking with contained sobs, and Sebastian felt a pang of empathy despite everything. This was a family in crisis, people who loved Abigail and were desperate for her to survive. But still, Abigail's words in the ambulance echoed in his mind, a ghost accusation that he couldn't ignore. While waiting in the hallway, Sebastian leaned against the wall next to the door, crossing his arms and closing his eyes for a moment. Fatigue was beginning to weigh on him, the weariness of a sleepless night combined with the emotional stress of the situation. He knew he should be alert, especially now that he was under suspicion, but it was hard to keep adrenaline flowing when there were moments of waiting like this. He opened his eyes again, forcing himself to remain focused and observed through the glass window. Victoria was talking to Abigail, although Abigail couldn't hear her, her lips moving in words that Sebastian couldn't hear through the thick glass. Ella remained by her grandmother's side, holding her other hand, her head bowed as if praying. It was an intimate scene of family love, and Sebastian felt like an intruder just watching. He looked away, deciding to give them more privacy, and focused his attention on the corridor, watching doctors and nurses pass by on their rounds, each busy with their own patients and emergencies. The hospital was a world apart, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a place where life and death eternally danced in precarious balance. "Did you really not give her anything?" The voice came from behind him, and Sebastian turned to see Jackson standing there, his hands shoved in his pockets. Jackson was looking at Sebastian with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't accusatory like Victoria's, nor desperate like Ella's, but there was a curiosity there, a need to understand. Sebastian straightened up, letting his arms fall to his sides, and looked directly into Jackson's eyes. "No," Sebastian said firmly. "I swear I didn't give her any medication. I barely had time to assess the situation before calling the ambulance. I found her already unconscious on the floor of the room." Jackson nodded slowly, as if he was processing the information and trying to decide whether to believe it or not. "Victoria is desperate," said Jackson, his voice coming out low and tired. "She's been taking care of her mother for so long, and the idea that something went wrong under her supervision is tearing her apart inside. She needs someone to blame, you understand? It's easier to blame you than to accept that perhaps she herself made a mistake." Sebastian felt a pang of frustration, but also understanding. He understood the psychology behind Victoria's behavior, even if he didn't like being the target. "I understand," said Sebastian, keeping his voice calm. "But I didn't make any mistake because I didn't have a chance to do anything. Whoever gave excessive medication to Mrs. Abigail, it wasn't me." Jackson sighed deeply, running his hand over his face in a gesture of extreme fatigue, and Sebastian realized that the man seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Victoria's mother has been a blessing and a burden," said Jackson, and there was a brutal honesty in his words that surprised Sebastian. "Victoria loves her too much, dedicates herself too much, and sometimes I think that blinds her to certain things. Abigail has been becoming increasingly confused in recent months, sometimes doesn't recognize people, sometimes acts erratically. I suggested we seek professional help, perhaps a specialized care home, but Victoria refuses. She insists on caring for her mother alone, even with Ella's help." There was a resignation in his voice, as if he had fought that battle many times and always lost, thought Sebastian, observing Jackson's tired expression. The man seemed to carry years of contained frustration, ignored suggestions and dismissed concerns. Sebastian was about to respond, to offer some word of understanding or consolation, when a shrill alarm cut through the silence of the hallway, coming from Abigail's room. The sharp and insistent sound made Sebastian's blood freeze instantly, and he turned to the door with his heart already racing in his chest. Through the glass window, he saw Victoria and Ella moving away from the bed in panic, their mouths open in silent screams that couldn't penetrate the thick glass. The machines next to the bed were flashing red, and Abigail was weakly convulsing, her thin body shaking as if having seizures. Sebastian didn't think, he just acted, pushing the door open and running inside, Jackson right behind him. Victoria was screaming something unintelligible, her hands covering her mouth, and Ella had huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with absolute terror. "Get out of the room, now," ordered Sebastian, his voice coming out firm and authoritative despite the panic threatening to consume him. He needed space, needed the doctors to arrive without obstacles. Victoria and Ella stumbled out, Jackson guiding them outside while Sebastian approached Abigail's bed. Her skin was even paler than before, almost grey like old paper, and her entire body was trembling, muscles contracting uncontrollably. The machines showed numbers dropping rapidly, and Sebastian knew enough to understand that it meant Abigail was getting worse, very, very quickly. He checked the small tube in her arm where the IV entered, making sure it was in the right place, and then pressed the red emergency button on the wall, the same one he had seen nurses press dozens of times in critical situations. The alarm changed tone, becoming even louder and more urgent, calling the entire medical team on the floor. Seconds later, which seemed like whole hours, the door violently opened and 3 nurses rushed in, followed closely by the doctor who had spoken with them earlier. The doctor looked at Abigail, then at the machines, and her face became even more serious. "She's very bad," said the doctor, her voice loud but controlled. Her body is reacting badly to the medications in her blood. We need to do something now or we're going to lose her. One of the nurses immediately adjusted the oxygen machine while another prepared an injection. Sebastian stood by, ready to help if needed, but also aware that he was under suspicion and that everything he did would be observed and questioned. The doctor worked quickly, administering a medication directly into the tube in Abigail's arm, her fingers moving rapidly. "I need her heart to start beating properly," she said to the nurses, and one of them handed another syringe to the doctor. Sebastian observed every movement, his own breathing quick and shallow, feeling the weight of everything even though he knew he hadn't caused this. Abigail was dying right before his eyes, and nothing they were doing seemed enough to save her. The machines continued beeping loudly, each sound echoing in the small room like a cry of despair. The doctor took a small light and opened Abigail's eyes, looking into them, and what she saw made her frown with concern. "Her eyes are reacting too slowly," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "The brain might be suffering because not enough oxygen is reaching it. We have a few minutes to reverse this, or she won't survive." The urgency in her voice was clear, and Sebastian felt his stomach churn. He had seen people die before, but never someone who was under his care, never someone he had promised to protect. "Doctor, there's still a lot of medication in her blood," said one of the nurses, looking at a paper with numbers. "Her body can't get rid of the medications fast enough. It's accumulating and poisoning her." The doctor bit her lip, clearly thinking quickly about what to do. "She needs a machine to clean her blood," she said, making a decision. "I need to call the specialists and transfer her to the ICU. Here in this room, we don't have the equipment she needs. Up there, they can put her on the machine that will remove the poison from her blood." One of the nurses ran out of the room to make the calls and prepare everything, her steps quickly echoing down the hallway. Sebastian remained where he was, feeling useless but unable to leave. He had been the first to notice the crisis when he heard the alarm, but now all he could do was watch as more prepared people tried to save Abigail. The doctor administered another medication, this time one that made Abigail stop shaking so much, her body finally relaxing a bit, although she was still unconscious and breathing with difficulty. "Come on, Abigail, you need to fight," the doctor murmured, and there was a gentleness in those words showing that even experienced doctors still cared about each patient. Sebastian saw this and felt a tightness in his chest. "The heart is beating a little better," announced one of the nurses, looking at the numbers on the machines. "Still very weak, but responding to the medications." There was a thread of hope in her voice, small but present. The doctor nodded, but her posture remained tense, shoulders rigid. "And the breathing?" she asked, checking the small tubes in Abigail's nose that delivered oxygen. "It's improving slowly," replied the nurse, rising little by little. Sebastian let out a long sigh he didn't know he was holding, feeling a tiny relief invade his tight chest. Abigail was fighting, her fragile body refusing to give up despite all the suffering. But the relief was short-lived, because the doctor turned to look directly at Sebastian, and there was something heavy in her eyes that made him swallow hard. "Were you here when this happened?" she asked, her voice calm but full of meaning. Sebastian nodded, feeling the weight of the question. "Yes, I was in the hallway out there talking to Mr. Jackson," he answered, pointing outside the room. "I heard the alarm from the machines and came running. The daughter and granddaughter were visiting when Mrs. Abigail suddenly got worse." The doctor studied him for a long moment, her eyes trying to read beyond his words. "And you didn't give her any medication before this?" "Nothing that wasn't recorded," she insisted. Sebastian felt anger beginning to boil inside him, but took a deep breath and kept calm. "No, doctor, I didn't give anything. I didn't even enter the room until I heard the alarm. I swear on my career." The tension in the room was so strong, it seemed possible to touch it. The doctor finally looked away, turning her attention back to Abigail, but Sebastian knew she still suspected him. He was being watched like a criminal, every step of his questioned, and part of him even understood why. 2 terrible crises in less than half a day, both happening when he was nearby, seemed too suspicious to be coincidence. But he had done nothing wrong, and needed to prove it before his entire life fell apart. The nurse who had left returned quickly, slightly out of breath. "The ICU is ready to receive her," she announced. "And the kidney specialist is coming to see if she needs to be put on the blood cleaning machine. We can take her as soon as it's safe to move her. The doctor nodded, looking at the machines once more. The heart is beating better now, she said, a slight relief in her voice. It's still weak, but we can transport her carefully. Let's take her before she gets worse again. The nurses immediately began preparing everything, turning off some machines and connecting smaller ones that could be taken along with the bed, organizing all the wires and tubes so nothing would get tangled. Sebastian stepped back, giving space, but his eyes didn't leave Abigail. Will she be able to survive all this? He asked, directing the question to the doctor, but somewhat talking to himself. The doctor paused what she was doing and looked at him with an honesty that hurt. I don't know, she said, and the sincerity in her voice was sad. Her body is failing because there's too much medication in her blood. Her kidneys aren't functioning properly. Her liver is overloaded, and her heart is too weak to endure much more. If we can clean her blood in time with that machine, she has a chance. But if she has another crisis like this... The doctor didn't finish the sentence, but Sebastian understood perfectly. Abigail was on the brink of death, holding on by very little, and any small thing could be the final push. He felt a knot in his throat, a sadness for the lady he barely knew, and an enormous frustration for the situation he found himself in. We've done everything we could for now, continued the doctor, returning to a professional tone. Now it depends on her. If she makes it through tonight, it will be a miracle. Her body needs to find strength to keep fighting, and we need to discover exactly which medications are in her blood and how to remove them. She looked directly at Sebastian again, her eyes serious and firm. And we need to find out who is doing this to her, because this was no accident. Someone is deliberately giving too much medicine to this lady, poisoning her slowly. The doctor's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Sebastian felt that everyone in the room quickly glanced at him before returning to work. He knew what they were thinking, saw it in their quick looks and expressions. He was the prime suspect, the stranger who had arrived just when everything started to go wrong, but he hadn't done anything, and this truth burned inside him like live embers. The team finished preparing Abigail, and two nurses began pushing the bed toward the door, the small portable devices beeping softly as they moved slowly through the room. The doctor followed alongside the bed, keeping an eye on the numbers the whole time, ready to act if anything worsened. Sebastian stood there watching the bed pass him, seeing Abigail's pale face disappear down the hallway, and felt an emptiness in his chest. Outside the room, Victoria was leaning against the wall crying non-stop, Jackson trying to calm her without much success. Ella was sitting on the floor, head between her knees, shoulders trembling. When they saw Abigail's bed passing, they all stood up and tried to approach. "Mum, my mum!" shouted Victoria, trying to reach Abigail's hand, but a nurse gently stopped her. "Ma'am, you need to let us work now," said the nurse with a firm but gentle voice. "We're taking her to a place where she'll receive the best possible treatment, but you can't come now, all right?" Victoria sobbed louder, and Jackson held her by the shoulders. Ella got up from the floor staggering, wiping her tear-soaked face with her hands. "Is she going to die?" asked Ella, her voice coming out thin and broken, almost childlike. "Is my grandma going to die?" The nurse looked at her with compassion but didn't lie. "She's very critical, dear," said the nurse, "but we're doing everything possible. The doctors upstairs are the best. You need to have faith and wait." The answer brought no comfort, only made Ella cry even louder, and Victoria joined her in a desperate embrace. Jackson stood there motionless, looking like someone who didn't know what to do, his hands hanging at his sides. Abigail's bed disappeared around the corner of the hallway, the sounds of the devices becoming fainter until they completely vanished, leaving behind a heavy and suffocating silence. Sebastian left the room and stood in the hallway, observing the destroyed family in front of him. He wanted to say something, anything that might help, but the words wouldn't come. How do you console people who have just seen someone they love almost die, especially when those same people think you're guilty? This only got worse after he arrived. Victoria suddenly shouted, turning to Sebastian with eyes full of anger and pain. "My mother was stable. She was taking her medicine properly, and then he shows up, and in less than a day she's dying." Her voice echoed down the hallway, drawing attention from other patients and visitors. Jackson stepped forward, placing himself between Sebastian and Victoria, hands raised in a pacifying gesture. "Victoria, please, you need to calm down," said Jackson, his voice tired but trying to be rational. "He saved your mother twice already. If it weren't for him, she would have died alone at home on the floor of her room. And now he was the first to press the emergency button when she got worse. He's trying to help." Jackson's words were logical, sensible, but Victoria was beyond reason at that moment. Ella, however, stepped forward, her face contorted in an expression that mixed pain, anger, and distrust. "Or he's causing the crises to look like a hero," shouted Ella, pointing a trembling finger at Sebastian. "Think about it, Mom. He shows up out of nowhere, and suddenly Grandma is having one crisis after another. I've known my grandmother for 25 years, since I was born. She never had anything like this. Never." Tears were streaming down Ella's face, but there was a conviction in her voice that made Sebastian feel a chill run down his spine. He was being accused directly now, without beating around the bush, without subtleties. "I didn't do anything wrong," said Sebastian, forcing his voice to come out steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "I swear to you I didn't hurt Miss Abigail. I'm trying to find out who did this to her." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Victoria advanced toward him, and Jackson had to hold her by the arms to prevent her from doing something she would regret later. "You did this to my mother," shouted Victoria, her voice torn with pain. "You came here and did this to her. I'm going to sue you. I'll make you pay for this." The words were like stabs, each one hurting more than the previous. Sebastian felt his legs weaken, the corridor seeming to spin around him, but he forced himself to stand, to maintain dignity. He had done nothing wrong, and he wouldn't bow under false accusations, no matter how much they hurt. At that moment, 2 police officers appeared in the corridor, walking toward the group with serious, professional expressions. They wore impeccable dark blue uniforms, and one of them, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, carried a small notebook. The other, younger, perhaps in his 30s, had his hand resting on his belt, close to where the police equipment was kept. Sebastian felt his heart sink even further. Someone had called the police, and he knew exactly who they were coming for. "Good evening," said the older police officer, his voice deep and controlled. "We received a call about a possible abuse situation against an elderly patient. Can you explain to us what's happening here?" His eyes passed over each person in the corridor, but eventually settled on Sebastian. Victoria immediately stepped forward, almost stumbling over Jackson, who was trying to hold her back. "It was him," said Victoria, pointing at Sebastian with a trembling hand. "This nurse that we hired. My mother was fine and now she's dying because of him. He gave her the wrong medications. He's doing this to my mother." Her voice was hysterical, the words coming out in quick, disconnected bursts. Ella quickly joined her mother, nodding vigorously. "It's true. I always took care of my grandmother together with my mother. We gave her the medications exactly right at the right time, everything perfectly. And then he arrives and in less than a day she's almost dead." Tears continued falling down Ella's face, and there was a passionate conviction in her voice that would make anyone believe her. The older police officer wrote everything down, asking specific questions, while the younger one approached Sebastian. "Are you the nurse responsible for the patient?" asked the young officer, his voice neutral but with a tone of authority that could not be ignored. Sebastian nodded, feeling his mouth dry as sandpaper. "Yes, sir. My name is Sebastian Silva. I've been a registered nurse for over 10 years. I was hired yesterday to care for Mrs. Abigail during the night." He tried to keep his voice calm, professional, but he could hear the tremor in it. "And did you administer any medication to the patient?" continued the officer, taking out his own small notebook. "No, sir," replied Sebastian, looking directly into the officer's eyes. "When I arrived for my first shift, I found Mrs. Abigail already unconscious on the floor of her room. I immediately called an ambulance and brought her to the hospital. I didn't have the time or opportunity to give her any medication. All of this is documented in the hospital records." The officer wrote everything down, his pen scratching the paper in quick movements. "And do you have any explanation for the patient's condition?" he asked. "The doctors are saying it's poisoning from excessive medication. How did this happen?" Sebastian took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "I found medication bottles hidden under Mrs. Abigail's bed," he explained, his voice becoming firmer now that he was stating facts. "Empty bottles of the same medications she was supposed to be taking. I brought them to the hospital, and they're being analyzed now." Someone was giving her extra medication, but it wasn't me. I just arrived yesterday." The officer exchanged a look with his older partner, and Sebastian saw something pass between them. Perhaps doubt, perhaps interest. "Where are these bottles now?" asked the older officer, approaching. "With the medical team," replied Sebastian. "They're analyzing them to see exactly which medications they are and in what quantities. The doctor responsible for Mrs. Abigail can confirm all of this." The older officer nodded slowly, making more notes. Victoria couldn't stay quiet, advancing again despite Jackson's efforts to contain her. "He's lying. He's making up this story about the bottles to protect himself," she shouted, her voice echoing through the corridor and causing more people to stop and observe the scene. "My mother never hid anything. I'm the one who takes care of her. I know everything. He's trying to blame someone who can't defend herself." Ella quickly agreed, hugging her mother from the side. "Grandma sometimes gets confused, but she never hid medications. This doesn't make sense. He must have put those bottles there to fool you." The accusation was serious, and Sebastian felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. Now he wasn't just being accused of negligence, but of fabricating evidence, of coldly planning everything. It was absurd, but he could see in the policeman's eyes that they were considering the possibility. "I didn't put anything under that bed," said Sebastian, his voice rising in volume for the first time. "I found those bottles when I was trying to understand what had happened to her. Why would I do that? Why would I bring evidence that incriminates me if I were guilty?" It was a good question, logical, but logic seemed to have little power in that emotionally charged situation. The older policeman raised his hand, asking for silence. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said with authority. "Let's go to the nursing station and talk to the medical team. We need the facts before drawing conclusions." He looked at Sebastian. "Sir, you'll need to come with us and answer some questions. This is not an arrest, but it is an official investigation." Sebastian nodded, knowing he had no choice. Resisting would only make him appear more guilty. "I understand, sir," he said, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "I will cooperate completely. I have nothing to hide." The officers led him down the hallway toward a small empty room that was normally used for private conversations with family members. Sebastian felt Victoria and Ella's eyes burning into his back, felt the weight of accusation like a chain around his neck. Jackson stayed behind with the two women, trying to calm them down, but his words were lost amid the sobs and shouting. Inside the small room, which had only a small table and 4 plastic chairs, Sebastian sat down as instructed. The two policemen stood, one on each side of the table, creating an intimidating atmosphere, even though they weren't being overtly aggressive. The older policeman opened his notebook to a new page and looked directly at Sebastian. "Let's start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me exactly what happened from the moment you arrived at that house last night. Don't skip any details." Sebastian took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts, and began to tell the whole story from the beginning. How he had arrived for his first shift, how he had found Abigail unconscious, how he had called the ambulance, about the hidden bottles, about the words Abigail had whispered in the ambulance about someone giving her extra medication. He spoke non-stop, his voice gaining strength as he relived each moment. The policeman meticulously wrote everything down, sometimes stopping to ask specific questions, requesting clarification about times and details. The younger policeman just observed, his eyes studying Sebastian's every movement, every facial expression, looking for signs of lying or nervousness. It was an interrogation disguised as a conversation, and Sebastian knew it, but he had nothing to hide, so he spoke freely. "And you have no prior relationship with this family?" asked the older policeman. "You had never met any of them before yesterday?" Sebastian shook his head firmly. "No, sir, it was the first time I'd seen them. The family hired me through a caregiver agency. I have references, records, everything documented. I can provide all contacts if needed." The policeman nodded, making more notes. "And do you have any idea who might be giving excess medication to the patient?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made Sebastian realize the policeman was genuinely trying to understand the case, not just looking for an easy culprit. Sebastian hesitated, because making accusations without proof was dangerous, but he also had a duty to protect Abigail. "I can't say for certain. Sebastian answered carefully. But Ms. Abigail specifically said it was a woman. She said someone was giving her more pills and telling her she had forgotten to take them. That means it's someone close, someone who has constant access to her and her medications. The older policeman stopped writing and looked at Sebastian with renewed interest. A woman? Repeated the policeman. So you're suggesting it could be the daughter or granddaughter? The question was direct, putting Sebastian in a difficult position. If he said yes, he would be accusing family members without solid proof. If he said no, he would be lying and hiding relevant information. I'm saying what Ms. Abigail told me, Sebastian answered carefully. I can't make accusations because I didn't see anything happening, but someone in that house has access to her medications and someone was giving extra doses. The hidden bottles prove this. They didn't get there by themselves. The older policeman nodded slowly, closing his notebook. All right, Mr. Sebastian. For now, you'll need to remain available for more questions. Don't leave town without informing us. We'll investigate this thoroughly, talk to the medical team, analyze the vials, and see what we find out. He paused, looking Sebastian directly in the eyes. If you're telling the truth, and I want to believe you are, then the truth will come out. But if we discover you're lying or hiding something, it'll be much worse for you. Understood? Sebastian nodded, feeling a small relief that at least the officers seemed willing to truly investigate, instead of just arresting him immediately. I understand, sir, and I appreciate you taking this seriously. Mrs. Abigail needs justice, and whoever is doing this to her needs to be discovered and stopped. The words came out with genuine conviction. The officers released him, but asked him to stay at the hospital in case they needed to speak with him again. Sebastian left the small room feeling exhausted, as if he had run a marathon. His muscles were tense, his head throbbed with an intense headache, and he was beginning to feel the fatigue of not having slept since starting his shift the night before. He looked at the clock on the corridor wall and saw it was past 3 in the morning. He had worked for more than 12 straight hours and still couldn't go home. Victoria, Jackson, and Ella were no longer in the corridor where he had left them. They had probably gone to some waiting room near the ICU where Abigail was now. Sebastian thought about going there, trying to talk to them again, but he knew it would be pointless. Victoria and Ella hated him now, blamed him for everything, and nothing he said would change that. Only concrete evidence could clear his name, and he needed to find it. He walked slowly down the corridor, his steps echoing in the silence of the hospital night, and found an empty bench near reception. He sat down, resting his head in his hands, feeling the weight of everything collapse on him at once. His career was at risk, his reputation was being destroyed, and an innocent lady was dying while the real culprit remained free. I can't give up on her, Sebastian muttered to himself, the words coming out low but firm. She's counting on me. I need to discover the truth. He raised his head, looking toward the corridor that led to the ICU, and made a decision. He wasn't leaving, wasn't abandoning Abigail, even if the family hated him, even if the police suspected him. He was going to stay there. He was going to watch. He was going to protect that fragile woman from whoever was trying to harm her, thought Sebastian, feeling a determination growing inside him like fire. He got up from the bench, stretching his sore back, and walked toward the nursing station. The night nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind but tired eyes, looked at him with surprise. Sebastian knew he looked terrible, eyes red from exhaustion, face pale, but he didn't care. I'd like to stay near Mrs. Abigail's room during the night, Sebastian said, keeping his voice low so as not to wake patients sleeping in nearby rooms. I know I'm under suspicion, but she's under my care, and I need to make sure she's safe. The nurse studied him for a long moment, and Sebastian saw compassion in her eyes. You look exhausted, she said gently, but I understand. There's a chair in the hallway near the ICU where you can sit. Just don't disrupt the team's work, all right? Sebastian nodded gratefully, feeling a small relief that at least someone wasn't judging him completely. Thank you, he said, and walked toward the ICU, his steps echoing softly on the polished floor. The ICU was a different place from the rest of the hospital, quieter, more tense, where each second seemed to matter more. The lights were low to allow patients to rest, but there were always nurses circulating, checking equipment, adjusting tubes and wires. Sebastian found an uncomfortable plastic chair in the hallway, positioned where he could see through the glass windows into the ICU. He sat down, adjusting his position to get a better view, and began his silent vigil. Through the glass, he could see Abigail in one of the beds, surrounded by machines that beeped softly, her small and fragile body almost disappearing beneath the white hospital blankets. There was a nurse beside her, checking something on one of the machines, making notes on a clipboard. The whole scene had an unreal quality, as if Sebastian were watching a sad movie instead of living that reality. He thought of Abigail, of how she had whispered those words in the ambulance, trying to warn him about the danger. She knew someone was hurting her, but she was too weak, too confused to identify who. "I'll find out," Sebastian promised quietly to himself. "I'll protect you, Miss Abigail. I won't let anyone hurt you again." The promise echoed in his mind, like a sacred oath. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging on like an eternity. Sebastian fought against sleep, forcing his eyes to stay open, drinking cold water that a kind nurse brought him, standing up to walk a little when he felt his legs going numb. He saw Victoria, Jackson and Ella pass by a few times, going to and from some nearby waiting room, but they didn't speak to him, only looked at him with expressions ranging from anger to distrust. Ella especially avoided his gaze, turning her face whenever she passed him. Sebastian didn't try to approach them, knowing it would be futile, but he observed their every movement, every interaction, looking for something, anything that could be a clue. Around 2:30 in the morning, a nurse allowed Victoria and Ella to briefly enter the ICU to see Abigail, while Jackson waited outside. Sebastian watched through the glass, seeing Victoria hold her mother's hand, her lips moving in silent words, perhaps prayers or promises. Ella stood further back, positioned at the foot of the bed, her hands clutching her own blouse, her face still marked by tears. There was something in her posture, a tension, a restlessness, that made Sebastian pay closer attention. "She looks guilty," Sebastian thought, and then mentally reprimanded himself. "Or maybe I'm just looking for guilt where there is only sadness. I can't let my suspicions blind me." But the feeling wouldn't leave him. After about 10 minutes, Victoria and Ella left the ICU, and the nurse accompanied them to the exit, explaining that they needed to let the patient rest. Jackson joined them, and the three walked back toward the waiting room, disappearing down the hallway. Sebastian remained in his chair, eyes fixed on the glass window, observing Abigail. He saw the nurse adjust some equipment, write something down, and then leave Abigail's room, probably to check on other patients. For a moment, Abigail was alone, just her and the machines keeping her body functioning. Sebastian felt a pang of fear, a primitive instinct telling him that she was vulnerable, exposed. He rose from the chair, feeling his knee joints crack after being still for so long, and walked to the ICU door. He knew he couldn't enter without permission, but he needed to be closer, needed to see better. Through the thick glass, he studied Abigail, looking for any sign of change in her condition. It was then that he noticed something he hadn't seen before, something that made his blood run cold. On Abigail's arms, where the sleeves of the hospital gown had risen slightly, there were marks. They weren't the bruises he had seen before, but something different, small scratches or superficial cuts that formed an irregular pattern. How did that get there? Thought Sebastian, his mind racing. She was in the ICU under constant supervision. How could someone have done this? The obvious answer was that nobody had done it recently, that the marks were already there before, but Sebastian couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He thought about Abigail's words, how she had said that someone was giving her extra medication. He thought about the vials hidden under the bed. He thought about the way Ella had quickly tried to explain the vials, saying her grandmother hid things out of confusion. Everything was starting to form a pattern in his mind, pieces of a sinister puzzle slowly fitting together. Sebastian made a risky decision. He needed to be inside that room, needed to be able to observe closely in case someone tried to do something. He waited until the nurse was busy with another patient on the other side of the ICU, and then, as quietly as possible, pushed the door and entered. His heart was pounding in his chest, blood roaring in his ears, but he moved quickly and silently like a ghost. Abigail's room was small, just the bed, the equipment, and a chair in the corner. There weren't many places to hide, but Sebastian looked around desperately, searching for any option. His eyes settled on the space under Abigail's bed. It was tight, uncomfortable. But it was the only place where he could stay without being immediately seen. I must be crazy, he thought, but even so he bent down and slid under the bed, the cold metal pressing against his back. Under Abigail's bed the world was different, claustrophobic and dark. Sebastian could only see small pieces of the room through the narrow space between the floor and the side rail of the bed. He could see the feet of the machines, the wheels of the bed, and if he turned his head to the side, he could see the door through a strange angle. His body was folded in an uncomfortable position, knees pressed against his chest, arms squeezed beside his body, but he forced himself to remain completely still and silent. Above him, so close he could almost touch, was Abigail, breathing softly with the help of oxygen, completely unaware of his presence. The machines beeped softly in a constant rhythm, the sound becoming hypnotic in the darkness. Sebastian could feel his own heart beating too hard, too loud, and he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Minutes passed, then half an hour, and Sebastian began to question his sanity. What was he doing there, hiding under the bed like a child playing hide-and-seek? If someone found him, it would look even more suspicious. Maybe he would even be arrested for trespassing or something worse. But he couldn't leave now, not after coming so far. He stayed there, waiting, watching, every muscle in his body aching from the forced position. Just a little longer, he told himself. Just a little longer, and I'll get out of here and accept that maybe I'm wrong. But deep down he knew he wasn't wrong. It was almost 3 in the morning when Sebastian heard the door to the room open slowly, so slowly it barely made a sound. He froze completely, even his breathing stopping for a moment, and slowly turned his head to see who was entering. Through the narrow space he saw a pair of sneakers, women's shoes, entering the room in careful and silent steps. The legs were thin, wearing gym pants that he recognized, and his heart sank when he realized who it was. Ella. She was entering Abigail's room in the middle of the night, alone, when she should have been in the waiting room with her mother and stepfather. Sebastian held his breath, his entire body tense as a violin string, watching Ella's feet move across the room. She paused for a moment at the door, and Sebastian imagined she was looking around, checking if she was alone, if anyone could see her. Apparently satisfied that there was no one, she continued entering, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Sebastian saw her feet approach the bed, so close that he could have touched her shoes if he extended his hand. Above him he heard the sound of a zipper being opened, and then the noise of objects being moved inside a bag. What is she doing? Sebastian thought, his heart now beating so hard that he was sure Ella could hear it. He needed to see, needed to know, but was trapped underneath, unable to move without revealing his presence. Ella stood beside the bed for a long moment, and Sebastian could hear her breathing above the sound of the machines, could hear her sniffling softly as if she was crying or trying not to cry. "I'm sorry, Grandma," Sebastian heard Ella whisper, her voice so low he could barely catch the words. "I didn't want it to come to this. I just can't let you sell the house. I can't lose anything else." The words were a confession, clear and undeniable, and Sebastian felt a mixture of horror and relief. Horror at what was happening, at what he was about to witness, and relief because he wasn't crazy, because his suspicions were correct. Ella was poisoning her own grandmother, had been doing it for months, and now, even with Abigail on the brink of death, she was about to do it again. Sebastian needed to act, needed to stop it, but he also needed to be sure, needed to see what she was doing so he could testify later. He turned his head a little more, trying to get a better angle, and through the narrow space, managed to see more. Keller had pulled something from her bag, a small vial she was holding in her trembling hand. Even in the dim light of the room, Sebastian recognized the shape. It was a medicine vial, identical to the ones he had found hidden under the bed at home. "No," Sebastian thought, feeling urgency take over. "I need to stop this now." But he waited another second, needing to see exactly what she was going to do. Hella approached the stand where the IV connected to Abigail's arm was, the medicine vial still in her hand. Sebastian saw her fingers trembling as she opened the cap of the vial, the small but clear sound in the silence of the room. She was about to put the medicine directly into the IV, which would make the liquid go straight into Abigail's bloodstream. A quick and efficient method of administering medication, but also extremely dangerous if the dose was wrong or if it was something the body could no longer process. Sebastian couldn't wait any longer. With a quick movement, he propelled himself out from under the bed, his sore body protesting against the sudden movement, and stood up so quickly that he felt slightly dizzy. Ella had her back to him, focused on the IV, and didn't hear him until it was too late. "What are you doing?" Sebastian's voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade, loud and full of authority. Ella turned around so quickly that she almost fell, her eyes widening in shock and absolute terror, when she saw Sebastian there, appearing out of nowhere like a ghost. The medication vial slipped from her trembling fingers and fell to the floor with the sound of glass hitting, rolling until it stopped under one of the machines. "You!" shouted Ella, her voice coming out high-pitched and hysterical. "What are you doing here? How did you get in?" But her words were empty, defensive, and Sebastian saw guilt written in every line of her face. Sebastian stepped forward, placing himself between Ella and Abigail's bed, creating a physical barrier between the granddaughter and grandmother. His hands trembled with adrenaline, but he kept his voice steady. "I was protecting her from you," he said, pointing to the fallen vial on the floor. "I knew someone was trying to hurt her, and I had to find out who it was. And now I know. It was you all along." Ella shook her head violently, tears already beginning to stream down her face. No, you don't understand," she said, her voice rising in panic. "I wasn't trying to take her life. I never wanted that. I was just trying to keep her calm." But her words only confirmed what Sebastian already knew. Sebastian walked to the intercom on the wall, the one that called nurses in emergencies, and pressed the button hard. An alarm sounded outside, and he knew that in seconds people would be coming in. "You were drugging your own grandmother," said Sebastian, his voice trembling with contained anger. "You were giving her excessive medication, poisoning her little by little, and when I arrived and was about to discover it, you tried to blame me. You tried to destroy my life to hide what you were doing." Ella fell to her knees on the floor, hands covering her face, violent sobs shaking her entire body. I didn't want to, she repeated between sobs. The door to the room opened violently, and 2 nurses rushed in, followed closely by the doctor on duty. They saw Sebastian standing next to Abigail's bed, Ella kneeling on the floor crying, and the medication vial fallen under the machine, and the whole scene made it clear that something very wrong had happened there. "What's happening here?" asked the doctor, her voice firm but full of confusion. Sebastian pointed to the vial on the floor. "She was about to put that in Miss Abigail's IV, he explained quickly. "I caught her in the act. She's the one who has been poisoning the patient." She just confessed. The doctor looked from Sebastian to Ella, who continued crying uncontrollably on the floor, and then bent down to pick up the fallen vial, examining it carefully. One of the nurses was already checking Abigail, making sure she was okay, that nothing had been administered before Sebastian intervened. The confusion in the room attracted more attention, and soon Victoria and Jackson appeared at the door, both with confused and concerned expressions. "What's happening? Why are there alarms?" asked Victoria, entering the room and stopping abruptly upon seeing Ella on the floor. "Ella, what are you doing here? What happened?" Her eyes went from her daughter to Sebastian, then to the doctor, looking for answers anywhere. Jackson remained paralyzed at the door, his expression changing from confusion to horror gradually as he processed the scene. Sebastian saw the exact moment when the man understood what was happening, saw the realization spread across his face like a wave. The doctor stood up, holding the vial carefully, and looked at Victoria with a grave expression. "Oh, your daughter was caught trying to add unauthorized medication to your mother's IV," said the doctor, her voice professional but cold. "Nurse Sebastian here stopped her and called for help immediately." Victoria looked at Ella, then at the vial in the doctor's hand, then back at Ella, and Sebastian saw denial fighting against understanding in her eyes. "No," said Victoria, shaking her head. "No, this doesn't make sense. Ella loves her grandmother. She would never do something like this. It must be a mistake." But even as she said the words, her voice faltered, breaking with doubt. Ella lifted her head from the floor, her face completely wet with tears, eyes red and swollen. She looked at her mother, and something in that look, some deep and undeniable guilt, made Victoria take a step back, stumbling on her own legs. "Ella," said Victoria, her voice coming out as a frightened whisper, Ella, what did you do? The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible, waiting for an answer that no one wanted to hear. Ella tried to speak, but only sobs came out first, her entire body trembling with the weight of everything. She gripped the floor with her hands, fingers curling against the cold linoleum, trying to anchor herself to something solid while her world crumbled. Sebastian remained where he was, watching, witnessing, feeling a strange mixture of victory for having proved his innocence and deep sadness for what was unfolding. A family was being destroyed right before his eyes, secrets being forcibly ripped from the darkness where they had hidden for so long. "Speak, Ella," said Jackson, finally finding his voice, though it came out hoarse and full of pain. "You need to tell us what's going on. You need to tell us the truth." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him to give some privacy, even though it was too late to hide it from everyone. Ella took a deep breath, a shaky and broken sigh, and finally began to speak, the words coming out in quick, disconnected bursts. "I did it," she said, and those 3 words fell like a bomb. "I've been giving extra medicine to Grandma for months. I hid the pills under her bed and gave them when you weren't looking. I said she had forgotten to take them, and she was so confused that she believed me." More sobs interrupted her, but she continued. "I never wanted to hurt her. I swear I never wanted that. I just wanted her to be quiet, calm, without energy to make plans, without energy to sell the house." Victoria brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a scream, and her legs finally gave way, causing her to fall into a chair in the corner of the room. Jackson stood frozen, his face losing all color, turning as pale as paper. The doctor and nurses watched in shocked silence, unwilling witnesses to a confession that should have happened in private, but was now exposed under the harsh lights of the ICU. Sebastian felt his heart tighten in his chest, not from joy at being right, but from sadness for the whole tragedy. Ella continued, the words now coming faster, as if a dam had burst and she couldn't stop the flow. "Grandma was wanting to sell the house where I grew up, where I have all my memories with Grandpa who died," she explained, her voice rising in pitch, becoming almost hysterical. "She was going to move to a smaller apartment and sell everything. That house is all I have left of him. It's the only place where I can still feel him close to me." She hit the floor with her fist, a desperate frustration overflowing. "When Grandpa died, I lost everything. He was my real father, not that man who abandoned me when I was a child. And now Grandma was going to take away the last thing that connected me to him. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." The words were a mixture of confession and justification, trying to make them understand the distorted logic that had guided her actions. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out broken and full of pain. "Ella, how could you?" she asked, tears flowing freely down her face. "How could you do this to your grandmother, to my mother? She loves you so much, she has always loved you, and you were slowly killing her." The accusation was raw, direct, and Ella shrank under the weight of them as if she had taken a physical blow. Jackson stepped forward, placing his hand on Victoria's shoulder, but his eyes remained fixed on Ella with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "And you were going to let Sebastian take the blame," said Jackson, his voice gaining an edge of anger. "You were going to destroy an innocent man, ruin his career, maybe even have him imprisoned, just to hide what you were doing." Ella looked at Sebastian for the first time since he had appeared from under the bed, and there was deep shame in her eyes. "I panicked when you hired him," she said, pointing to Sebastian with a trembling hand. "I knew he would find out. He was trained, professional, would notice things you never noticed. So I tried to make you suspicious of him first, tried to place the blame on him before he discovered the truth." The confession was complete now, every secret exposed, every lie revealed. I'm so sorry," Ella cried, her body curving in on itself. "I never wanted her to get so bad. I just wanted more time, just more time in the house before losing it forever." Sebastian finally moved, stepping forward, his voice coming out firm, despite the emotion threatening to break it. "Ella, I need you to tell me exactly what medications you gave her," he said, forcing himself to focus on what mattered now. "In what doses? Doctors need to know now to save her. Every minute counts." He looked at the doctor, who nodded vigorously, already grabbing a clipboard to take notes. Ella looked at Sebastian, then at the doctor, then at her grandmother lying unconscious and fragile in the bed, and the full reality of what she had done finally seemed to hit her with full force. She opened her mouth to answer, but only sobs came out, her entire body shaking so violently that she couldn't form coherent words. Victoria rose from her chair, stumbling to her daughter, and grabbed her shoulders tightly, shaking her. "Ella! Speak. Are you going to let your grandmother die after everything you've done?" Victoria shouted, her voice echoing through the room. "Talk now. What medications did you give her?" The urgency in Victoria's voice finally seemed to penetrate Ella's shock, and she tried to focus, tried to remember through the tears and panic. But before she could answer, the machines next to Abigail's bed began to beep loudly, a sharp and urgent sound that made everyone in the room freeze for a second. The doctor dropped the clipboard and rushed to Abigail's bedside, quickly checking the machines, and her face turned pale. "She's having another crisis," the doctor shouted to the nurses. "Her heart is failing. We need an emergency team here now." One of the nurses ran out of the room shouting for help, while the other began preparing resuscitation equipment. Sebastian saw the numbers on the machines dropping rapidly, saw Abigail's body begin to tremble, and felt panic take over. They were losing her right there, right now, while the person who knew exactly what had poisoned her was having a breakdown on the floor. "Ella!" Sebastian shouted, turning to her with desperate urgency. "It doesn't matter what you did. It doesn't matter anymore. But if you have any love for your grandmother, if there's any part of you that still cares, you need to tell us now. Which medications? How many? When was the last dose?" His voice was hoarse from shouting, but he needed her to understand the absolute gravity of the moment. Victoria shook Ella again, harder this time, her fingers digging into her daughter's shoulders. "Ella, your grandmother is dying." "She's dying right now. You're the only one who can save her. Please, my daughter, please," Victoria begged, her voice breaking completely on the last word. Ella looked up, seeing for the first time the scene on the bed, seeing her grandmother convulsing, the doctors working frantically, and something inside her finally truly broke. "All the medications she was already taking," Ella shouted, the words finally coming out in a desperate rush. "I gave extra doses of everything, the medications for blood pressure, for diabetes, for sleep, for anxiety, everything. I gave them early in the morning before you woke up, and at night when you were asleep. Sometimes 2 extra doses a day, sometimes 3. She was screaming now, hysterical, but at least she was talking. The doctor, even while working on Abigail, shouted to a nurse, "Write everything down. We need exact doses." The nurse started writing frantically while trying to extract more specific information from Ella. "How many milligrams? Do you remember the quantities?" asked the nurse, her voice loud but controlled. Ella shook her head, eyes wide. "I don't know. I just gave what was in the bottles. 1 extra pill of each, sometimes 2. She was clearly panicking, trying to remember details through the confusion. Jackson, finally emerging from his state of shock, grabbed Ella's bag that had fallen to the floor and turned it upside down, emptying the contents onto the floor. Several medication bottles rolled out, along with wallets, keys, and other personal items. He picked up the bottles one by one, reading the labels aloud to the nurse who was taking notes. Jackson picked up the bottles one by one, showing them to the nurse who was frantically writing everything down. He read each label in a low voice as the nurse recorded the information, his fingers trembling as he held each bottle. The nurse wrote quickly while the doctor worked on Abigail, applying treatments to reverse the effects of the poisoning, adjusting machines, shouting orders to other nurses who ran in and out of the room. Sebastian remained there watching everything, feeling a mixture of relief for finally having the necessary information and anguish at seeing Abigail fighting for her life. Victoria had released Ella and was now leaning against the wall, her legs trembling so much she could barely stand, watching her daughter confess and her mother dying. The entire scene seemed like a nightmare from which no one could wake up, a family tragedy unfolding under the cold and merciless lights of the ICU. She remained on the floor crying non-stop, her whole body trembling, repeating between sobs that she didn't want her grandmother to die. "Now we have what we need," the doctor shouted to the team. "Prepare the treatments and let's work quickly. We need to clean her blood as fast as possible." Sebastian closed his eyes for a moment, a silent prayer escaping his lips, asking that Abigail would hold on just a little longer. The next 48 hours were the longest of Sebastian's life. He didn't leave the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs when exhaustion overcame him, eating sandwiches that barely had any taste, living on strong coffee and pure determination. The police had taken Ella to give a formal statement, and Victoria and Jackson stayed in a nearby waiting room, trapped in their own personal hell of guilt and pain. Sebastian visited Abigail whenever they allowed, watching through the ICU glass while machines worked to filter the poison from her blood, while doctors and nurses monitored every beat of her heart, every breath that entered and left her lungs. He saw that fragile woman fighting for her life and felt a strange connection with her, as if they had gone through a war together and were now on the same side of the trench. During these 2 days, Sebastian thought a lot about everything that had happened, about how a family could destroy itself from within while appearing normal from the outside, about how love could twist into something sick when mixed with loss and despair. He thought about Ella, so young and so lost, unable to let the past go. Sometimes the people we love are the ones who hurt us the most, Sebastian thought, watching Abigail through the glass. And sometimes we hurt those we love the most without even realizing how much. The reflection weighed on his heart like lead. At the end of the second day, when the sun was beginning to rise outside, painting the sky orange and pink, a nurse came to Sebastian with a tired but genuine smile. "She's responding well to the treatment," said the nurse, and there was true relief in her voice. "The doctors managed to remove the toxins from her blood. She's still weak, very weak, but she's stable now. And she woke up a few minutes ago, asked for water." Sebastian felt his legs almost give way beneath him, the relief so intense it almost hurt physically. He had been holding his breath for so long, maintained hope with such strength that when he could finally relax, he didn't quite know how to do it. Tears appeared in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them, letting them fall freely down his tired, bearded face. The nurse touched his shoulder gently, a gesture of understanding and compassion. "You can see her if you want," she said, "but only for a few minutes. She still needs a lot of rest." Sebastian nodded, wiping his face with the backs of his hands, trying to compose himself before entering the room. "Thank you," he said, his voice coming out hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for saving her. Thank you for not giving up." The nurse smiled and led him to the ICU door. Sebastian entered Abigail's room with careful steps, as if entering a sacred place. She was lying in bed, her eyes open but tired, her face still pale but with more color than before. When she saw him, her lips curved into a weak smile, and she raised her hand tremulously, a silent invitation for him to come closer. Sebastian walked to the bedside and took that fragile hand in his, feeling its warmth, the pulse beating strong and steady under the thin skin. "You didn't give up on me," whispered Abigail, her voice coming out weak but clear. "Even when everyone doubted you, even when they tried to blame you for everything, you stayed. You protected me." The words came out with effort, each one seeming to cost precious energy, but she needed to say them, needed him to know. Sebastian gently squeezed her hand, unable to trust his own voice at the moment. Abigail closed her eyes for a second, gathering strength, and when she opened them again, there were tears shining in them. "It was Ella, wasn't it?" she asked, and although it was a question, her voice carried the certainty of someone who already knew the answer. "My granddaughter, my Ella." Sebastian just held her hand in silence, not wanting to confirm with words what she already knew in her heart. Abigail closed her eyes again, and tears flowed from the corners, wetting the white pillow. "I knew," she said, her voice breaking. "Deep down I always knew, but I didn't want to believe it. I felt that something was wrong, felt that someone was giving me too many things, but when I tried to remember, everything became confused in my head. And Ella was always so attentive, so caring, saying that I had forgotten to take my medications, taking care of me." She sobbed softly, her weak body shaking with emotion. "How did I not see it? How did I let this happen? She's my granddaughter. I raised her. I loved her since the day she was born. How did I not notice she was hurting me?" The pain in Abigail's voice was visceral, not just the physical pain of a recovering body, but the much deeper emotional pain of a family betrayal. Sebastian sat in the chair beside the bed, still holding her hand, and let her cry. knowing there were no words that could comfort that kind of pain. He was just there, present, offering the only support he could, the support of someone who believed her when no one else did. "None of this is your fault, Mrs. Abigail," Sebastian finally said, his voice low but firm. "None of this was your fault. Ella was dealing with things she couldn't process alone, and she made terrible choices. But that's not a reflection of you or the love you gave her." The words were true, but Sebastian knew it would take time for Abigail to believe them. The following days brought quick and almost miraculous recovery. With the correct information about what was poisoning Abigail, doctors were able to reverse the damage before it became permanent. A week later, the doctor came to the room with surprising news. "Mrs. Abigail, I have good news," said the doctor, smiling for the first time since everything had begun. "The latest tests show that your organs have responded very well to the treatment. We managed to act in time. You will recover completely." Abigail widened her eyes, almost not believing what she heard. "Completely?" she repeated, her voice full of hope. "Yes," the doctor confirmed. "You will need to follow up for a few months and be careful, but there will be no permanent damage. You were very lucky and had a very dedicated nurse who didn't give up on discovering the truth." The doctor looked at Sebastian with genuine respect. Abigail began to cry with relief, and Sebastian felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. Her life would not be forever defined by that trauma. She would have a real second chance to start over. During recovery, the police came to speak with Abigail about prosecuting Ella. A kind investigator explained that they had sufficient evidence but needed her cooperation. Abigail listened to everything in silence and then asked for time to think. That night, she talked with Sebastian. "What should I do?" she asked, her eyes full of doubt. "She almost destroyed me, made me feel like I was going crazy, but she's my granddaughter. I saw her being born. How do I do this?" The anguish in her voice was clear. Sebastian thought carefully before answering. "Mrs. Abigail, you don't need to decide in a hurry," he said gently. "First, heal completely. Let your mind process everything, then think clearly about what's best for everyone." Abigail nodded, squeezing Sebastian's hand. "Thank you for being here," she said. "Thank you for letting me be weak when I need to." Sebastian smiled. "You are not weak, Mrs. Abigail. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known." The words came from the heart. 2 weeks later, Abigail made her decision. Victoria came to visit her, destroyed by guilt. "Mother, I don't know what to do," said Victoria through tears. "She's my daughter, but what she did was terrible. How can I choose between you two?" Abigail took her daughter's hand. "You don't need to choose," she said firmly. "I've already decided. I won't prosecute Ella." Victoria widened her eyes, surprised. "But I have conditions," continued Abigail. "Ella will go to therapy, will work with a professional to understand why she did what she did. She will get a real job and use part of her salary to pay for my medical treatment. Not because I need it, but because she needs to understand that actions have consequences." Abigail took a deep breath. "And she will sell that house. She'll use the money to start a new life, her own apartment, away from the shadows of the past." That house was keeping her in a place of pain. Victoria cried even more, but this time with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mother," she said. "Thank you for being bigger than all of this." Abigail just nodded, tired but at peace with her decision. 3 months passed. Abigail recovered completely and moved to a new apartment, small and full of light, where she restarted her life. Sebastian continued as her caregiver and true friend. The old house was sold, and Ella moved to an apartment on the other side of the city, got a job in a library and started weekly therapy. She sent letters to Abigail every week, asking for forgiveness in different ways. Abigail read them all crying, but kept her responses in her heart, not yet ready to speak. One day Victoria showed up at the apartment. "Mom, Ella is asking to see you," Victoria said nervously. She knows she doesn't deserve it, but she would like a chance to apologize in person. Abigail was silent for a long moment, and then nodded. "Bring her," she said simply. The next day, Victoria brought Ella. The young woman entered the apartment with her head down, too thin, her eyes swollen from crying. When she saw her grandmother, she stopped at the door, trembling. Abigail was sitting in the armchair, and Sebastian was nearby, as always. The initial silence was heavy, loaded with everything that had happened. Finally, Abigail spoke. "You hurt me deeply, Ella," she said, her voice firm but not cruel. "You broke my trust in a way I never thought possible. But looking at you now, I see that you were suffering too, and I didn't realize it. I should have seen your pain when Grandpa died. I should have helped you process that loss." The words were honest, not trying to smooth over the truth, but also without hatred. Ella fell to her knees, sobbing. "Grandma, I was selfish," she said between tears. "I put my memories, my pain, above your life. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve anything. But I swear I'm changing. I'm in therapy, I'm working, I'm trying to understand why I did that and making sure I never hurt anyone like that again." Her voice broke with every word. Abigail rose from the armchair, walked slowly to Ella and knelt with difficulty beside her. She placed her hand on her granddaughter's wet face, forcing her to look into her eyes. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Ella," said Abigail, her own voice choked now. "Forgiveness is about liberation, freeing you from the guilt that's consuming you, and freeing me from the anger that could destroy me. I forgive you, my little granddaughter. I forgive you because I love you and because I want to move forward too." Ella collapsed in her grandmother's arms, and the two cried together, holding each other, beginning the long healing process that would take time, but had finally begun. "But rebuilding trust will take time," Abigail said later, gently pushing Ella away. "A long time. Let's take it slow, okay?" Ella nodded vigorously, wiping her face. "All the time you need, Grandma. I'll wait. I'll prove that I've changed." The words were a promise. Months later, on a sunny spring day, Sebastian took Abigail for a walk in the park near the apartment. She was fully recovered now, strong, laughing, telling stories from her youth that Sebastian had never heard. They walked slowly along the stone path, enjoying the warm sun and the singing of birds. On the other side of the park, there was a group of volunteers organizing a book fair to raise funds for the municipal library. Sebastian noticed first and touched Abigail's arm, pointing discreetly. There was Ella wearing an apron with the library logo, organizing books on a table, laughing at something another volunteer had said. She looked different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Abigail stopped walking, observing her granddaughter from afar, and Sebastian saw emotions pass over her face, good and bad memories mixing. Ella turned at that moment, as if feeling she was being watched, and her eyes met Abigail's across the park. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the distance between them both physical and emotional. Then, hesitantly, Ella raised her hand and waved timidly, a small but brave gesture. Abigail stood still for a second that seemed to last forever, and Sebastian could almost feel the internal battle happening inside her. Finally, slowly, Abigail raised her own hand and waved back. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't complete reconciliation. It didn't erase everything that had happened or heal all wounds at once. But it was a beginning, a small step towards something new, something better. Sebastian felt a smile appear on his face, and when he looked at Abigail, he saw tears in her eyes, but this time they were different tears, tears of hope instead of pain. They continued walking, moving away from that part of the park, and Abigail was silent for a few minutes, processing the moment. Finally, she stopped again, turning to Sebastian with an expression of deep gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved me from more than death, Sebastian. You saved me from bitterness, from hatred, from becoming someone defined only by pain. You showed me there was still life on the other side of all this." Sebastian felt his own throat tighten with emotion. "You did all the hard work, Miss Abigail," he said. "I just was here. The courage, the forgiveness, the strength to move forward, all of that was yours." Abigail smiled, a full and genuine smile, and resumed walking, leaning slightly on Sebastian's arm. The sun shone upon them. The park was full of life and laughter, and for the first time in a long while, the future seemed not only possible but promising. Did you like the story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there, and I'll be waiting for you.